सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
This is the Dussehra evening just before sunset, so my greetings first, and also as I speak, as is customary, as I speak on Dussehra about the speech of the RSS Sarsanghchalak, because he addresses the cadres every Dussehra, and that becomes a kind of his equivalent of the State of the Union address. So I will talk about that, and as I say that, let me also mention that you might hear some background music, some devotional background music as I talk. That's because in the park right behind my home, a sizable Dussehra Mela takes place. That Mela and crackers and patakas will begin soon enough. So I have limited time to finish this, and I hope you enjoy the music as I speak. Now, Sarsanghchalak, this is his 10th speech in the Modi era. 2014 was the first. This is the 10th. So this is also the last in the second term of Modi government. Now, next year will be another election and a fresh government will be sworn in India, but this is the 10th of Modi's 10 years, and we have to see how Sarsanghchalak has progressed in these 10 years. And I can draw some basic inferences from what he has said. I will just give you a very quick summary of what he said in each year, just a one-line summary, but basically year on year on year on year, you can see that he's become less political. His message is less political. His message is less abrasive. It is talking less and less and less about any issues of polarization. It's actually become increasingly from beginning to be political and agenda setting. He's no longer setting the agenda for the government. In these 10 years, year on year on year on year, he's now come to a stage where he's articulating the government's policy instead of setting the agenda or giving the government direction. One, articulating the government's policy, and second, praising the government's policy and success. That in the history of RSS is a very big change. I will take you back to a national interest piece that I wrote in January this year. You can take a look at that piece. I will share a link to the text article as well as the video, so you can see that. In that article, I had said, and the headline was, RSS is strongest and weakest it's ever been in its history, pitfalls of going from rebel to core of the establishment. So what had we said? We had said that RSS, for the first 90 years of its founding, next 2025, as the Sarsanghchalak noted today, will be the 100 years since the constitution of the RSS. In the first 90 years of its founding, RSS was a constant rebel. It was a constant rebel. It was on the defensive, even during the 6 years that Vajpayee government was in power, because the RSS never saw the Vajpayee government as its own government. And truth to tell, the compliment was returned. I don't know who started it first, chicken or the egg. You can make that call. You can take that call. But Vajpayee government also, particularly Atal Bihari Vajpayee, did not see that government as a government of the RSS. So the RSS was adversarial right through those 90 years, even during Vajpayee's 6 years, while a BJP-led NDA government, essentially run by Swayamsevaks, they were in power. The RSS was still adversarial. If you have any doubts, look at all the utterances and statements of K.S. Sudarshan, who was then the Sarsanghchalak. If at all RSS wanted to do something constructive with the government, that was to give the government advice, that was to tell the government what to do, try and set the agenda, most of which Vajpayee ignored. So almost all the economic reform that Vajpayee carried out, the RSS was opposed to at that point of time. RSS also had issues with Vajpayee's foster family, also with the way Vajpayee was running his prime minister's office. Rise of Modi, however, changed it. And we said in that national interest article in January earlier this year, and now it is reaffirmed with the Sarsanghchalak's 10th speech today, that the RSS's status has now changed. RSS, from being guru of its shishyas who joined politics, has now become a kind of follower. I don't want to say that it's become the Shishya and its Shishyas have become gurus. That would be too radical. But the fact is that the RSS, if you go from 2014 to 2023, from the first address under Narendra Modi to the 10th address under Narendra Modi, from giving advice in 2014, the Sarsanghchalak, it is who in his Dussehra speech talked about self-reliance. Self-reliance, Narendra Modi brought it to the national forefront in 2021, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, where he said the pandemic has taught me that self-reliance is the way to go forward. So for 6 years, nobody paid attention to this. It only picked up as an idea when Narendra Modi started using it. After that, RSS has been praising it, backing it, so on and so forth. In the first speech, Sarsanghchalak also talked about the need for cultural education. So 2014, he was still setting the agenda for the government. I told you the two highlights, self-reliance and cultural education. These highlights, however, credit must go where it's due, have been picked up by my colleague Unnati Sharma. So self-reliance and cultural education, he was setting the agenda for Modi government as the Modi government took power. 2015, the next speech, he came up with the idea of a new population policy. And he said, with new population policy, you also need a new security policy. Again, he's asking for new things. He's asking the government for new things. He's no longer upbraiding the government as his predecessor, K.S. Sudarshan, might have done with the Vajpayee government, but now he's still setting the agenda for the government. He's still telling the government what to do. So he's saying new population policy, population is growing too fast, new security policy is needed. And also he said a way has to be found to regulate the media without taking away its freedoms, if such a thing is possible. But that is what he again suggested. So he was front running the government still. 2016, there was a little bit of pushback from him, because that is when lynchings had taken place and there was a lot of criticism of the government. So he defended the government, but he said that govrakshaks will still continue to do their job dutifully. So that was a little pushback from him. 2017 speech from him was probably, and that's what my colleague Unnati Sharma also notes, 2017 speech was probably his most political speech yet. Why? Because that's when the new Niti Aayog that Modi government had set up, that was coming up with new ideas for economic growth. And those ideas were not very different from the reform ideas of the past, coming in from the Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh era, and then percolating into Deve Gowda's government, and then Vajpayee, and then Manmohan Singh's UPA. So he again pushed back at it, and he said, look, you can carry out some reform and economic changes will cause tremors, instability, etc. But you have to minimize these. But these reforms should be implemented in such a way that they should have the minimum impact. Obviously, it means negative impact on MSMEs or micro, small and medium enterprises. And then he also said, again, the last time he used a word of criticism, and that's why we say this was his most political speech in these 10 years, 14, 15, 16, 17. 14, 15, 16, 17. That's his fourth speech. Since then, political content in his speech has declined. And right now, his speech is purely reflecting and praising what the Modi government is doing. So that is a big change for an organization which was always the guru of its shishyas who went out to run politics. Now what we had said in January, that the RSS has been the strongest and the weakest ever, is also signified or underlined by this speech. That's because the RSS ideology now runs the nation. So ideologically, it's the strongest ever. As a moral and political force over people who wield power through its ideology, its hold is now minimal. It's now the lowest, and it no longer even pretends to set the agenda for them. I don't have to make this statement as an opinion. You can just read or watch the Sarsanghchalak speech today. All the all these sermons there are not for the government or not for politicians who owe their rise to the RSS or their training or education to the RSS. All the sermons are for people like you and me, for citizens of India. We'll talk about that also a little bit as we go ahead. And the same 2017 speech, which we say was the most political, it's also talked about national security is a running thread. 2018, once again, he's in front of the government. He's not behind the government. 2018, he's expressing, without sounding impatient, but he's expressing impatience that Ram Mandir is not yet built. And he says that if it's taking time, government should pass a law and build the temple. And then we know what happened, the Supreme Court order, etc., etc. 2019, once again, he's on the defensive. He's on the defensive because by this time, a few incidents of lynching have taken place. And 2019 is also the year in which Modi government carries out the big changes in Kashmir. So now he devotes quite a bit of time praising the Modi government for changes in Kashmir, because now his pupils, as in RSS's pupils are implementing its agenda. In this long distance race, RSS's pupils or shishyas have actually run ahead of the organization and the gurus. So they made the changes in Kashmir that the RSS has always been wanting and probably did not know was going to happen and was not expecting, because it was such a surprise to everybody and it was kept such a secret. Dussehra came a couple of months after those changes, so there was praise for the government. But at the same time, there was a little bit of defensiveness still because a few incidents of lynching had taken place. And while sort of decrying those incidents or any violence, he also said that lynching is actually a Western concept. Which brings us to 2020. By this time, Narendra Modi settled in his second term with a larger majority. He's also made the big changes in Kashmir. The temple, the door to temple building or the path to the temple is now open. By this time, Sarsanghchalak's focus shifts. So focus shifts and emphasis shifts. And this is the turning point where his focus and emphasis are almost entirely, if not entirely, almost entirely endorsing and praising the government, its policy and its actions. And there is no intention or there is no inclination now to set the agenda for the government or remind the government that, look, we also want this done. You also have to do this. That is now over. 2020 speech for the first time is now a teacher applauding its favorite student. So in that speech, RSS chief actually backed the 3 farm laws, which, if you go back to the history of Swadeshi, to the history of suspicion of the private sector in agriculture, was quite interesting. So RSS chief in 2020 backed farm laws. He also backed CAA, and he said this is not against any religion, and Muslim brothers, hamare Musalman bhai, they've been misled, and there is need now to counter those misconceptions. Then he also talked about, once again, there is some little suggestion to the government saying that there is a threat from China. By this time, the Chinese are sitting on dharna in East Ladakh. So he says there is also need for government to find allies against China, so build alliances against China. And he specifically mentions some neighboring countries, including Sri Lanka. Interesting. 2021, he again talks about population policy, need for population policy, need for NRC all over the country. And then he makes some social comments. For example, his suspicions and criticism over, say, Bitcoin, right? And also OTT platforms. But once again, that is social, and this population policy is probably the last time he gave the government any advice. But you can see the advice is now really whittled down from self-reliance and cultural education, new population policy, etc. Now he's again saying population policy, but he's repeating that 2014 advice. But now beyond that, nothing. And 2022, now talking about unity, etc. And he's now even shifted. He's even shifted from his population policy plank. 2014, 2015, 2021, he talked about the need for a new population policy. Now he shifted, probably because by this time data had come from China showing how Chinese population was declining and what a negative effect it had had on China. Plus lots of other data had come up on Indian population growth, including NFHS 4 and 5, Pew Research, data from WHO, and also from UN agencies showing that India's population growth had slowed down much more than had been imagined earlier, and India's fertility rates were really down. So he's now moved on from demand for population policy for controlling population or reducing population growth to now talking about population imbalance. And in that speech, very significantly, he said, and we had noted it in our Clutter episode then, he very significantly said that population imbalance doesn't take place because of birth rates, because he had now moved on. He had gotten off that curve that some people produce more babies. He said it takes place, it comes into being because of migration and because of conversion. And the examples he used were very interesting because the examples he used were Kosovo, East Timor, and Sudan. The three countries that he said broke up because of population imbalance. So once again, you can see his evolution. The 2023 speech now, the 2023 speech now, this could be easily a speech given by any school headmaster or any head of a temple sect, or maybe a head priest of a temple, or maybe a spiritual guru, or maybe a church elder. Anybody. This is a motherhood and apple pie speech, which is telling everybody to be a good citizen, etc., etc. But there are some interesting things. First of all, there is this fervent wish and also celebration of the fact that India has now really risen. So I told you, from showing the path to the government or telling government what to do, this is now praising the government. So he says that the world has tried various methods, ideologies, faiths, this and that, to stay together and to fight the perfect way, but the world has failed. So the world is now looking up to India. So Vishwaguru. And India is now ready to play that role. And then he says, we have to learn from all the others and accept what is Samayanukul, which means what is relevant to today's times. He says that India is rising. The rise and growth of India is not something that makes some people in India and overseas, he says especially overseas, unhappy, because he says this threatens many vested interests in India and overseas, more overseas than India. He said all of these people want to create trouble in India, जिससे वो अपना उल्लू सीधा करना चाहते हैं, which means to fulfill their own agendas. And then he says they come with glib talk. So the expression he uses is chikni chupdi. They come with glib talk, chikni chupdi, and try to destabilize us. And he says, what do you call them? He says some people say cultural Marxist. Some people say woke. So for the RSS chief to now launch an attack on woke culture is very interesting. Opinion, 2 bits worth of opinion from me. Wokeism is a very interesting and very polarizing issue of debate in the Western world, particularly in Western democracies, Europe, America, etc. In India, where religion is so powerful, and where between being secular, between having a secular constitution and people following their own religions in the most devout manner possible, there is no contradiction. So wokeism, at least in India, is something that's confined to maybe one odd campus, a couple of campuses, a few academics, a few commentators, not beyond that. But now to paint wokeism as this straw man, which is now out to destroy India or destabilize India, is a bit exaggerated. That is my opinion. So let me also get off that curb, since I used that expression earlier about this Sarsanghchalak. He goes on to say that by 1920, followers of Marx knew that his prophecy was not coming. So they forgot his prophecy. And they thought the solution now or strategy now is to oppose everything sensible. And through that, they've taken control of media and academia. And they are also corrupting them. Then he says, Shiksha, Sanskar और राजनीति सबको भ्रष्ट करने की कोशिश है. That means they are trying to corrupt your education, your morals, and also your politics. And they are trying to spread fear and also grab the social spaces. Then he uses another expression, which I will try to translate, but I may not be able to do so adequately. He says, mantra viplav, which really means a mantra of revolt or mantra of anarchy, that they practice mantra viplav of a mantra of anarchy. And he says that if this goes on, then praja sahit raja ka bhi satyanash hoga. He doesn't use that expression satyanash, but I'm just simplifying it. So he says if this goes on, this will damage the people as well as the rulers. And then he says they create anarchy and uses another Hindi expression or Sanskritized Hindi expression, Asuri Shakti. So this is Dussehra. Asur is a Rakshas, like, so Ravan was an Asur, right? So Asuri Shakti, that is demonical forces, Asuri Shakti. And he says this Asuri Shakti is now been unleashed. And then he goes on to blame some of this from Manipur as well. And then he says, Humko ladakar desh ko todne wali taakatein. That means those who want us to fight so they can break up our country. So again, it's about foreigners. And he says, anytime there is a little bit of trouble in India, and he says, dekhte dekhte, which means before you can bat your eyelid, छोटा बड़ा देश विदेश से हर कोई चिंता और चेतावनी हिंसा भड़काने वाली हरकतें करने लगता है. That means anytime there is a little bit of trouble in India, then within India and outside, people start expressing concern, people start sending warnings and threats, and the idea is to cause instability in India. Now, there are other interesting things that he uses, and some of which I am trying to decode. He says, for example, 350 years of slavery for India. So I'm trying to calculate from where does the 350 years begin. If we got independence in 1947, then generally that would be when Emperor Akbar died and Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and then Aurangzeb took over. So I don't know if that period ends with 2014. I don't know where it goes back. But he said 350 years of slavery. That's a bit different from the other RSS people who've been saying 1,000 years of slavery so far. So 350 years, I'd like to see what that cutoff is, but I don't know the answer as yet. So I'm not telling you just now, but maybe DK Singh, our political editor, will tell you in the course of time. And the other thing he says very interestingly, he says, read Ambedkar's two speeches. And the speech that Ambedkar delivered on 25th November 1949, while presenting the final draft of the Constitution. So what Sarsanghchalak is referring to, I suspect, in Ambedkar's speech is where Sarsanghchalak is saying, and there's a reference in Ambedkar's speech to the same points where Sarsanghchalak makes a call to shed victimization, shun mutual distrust. He says it doesn't mean that you are surrendering to somebody. This is an exhortation to all to recognize the thread of cultural continuity and unity that runs through our country and its diversities. Now, this is a point that Ambedkar also makes in his speech. But importantly, as I started reading of that speech, and I will share a copy with you, my friend and my former colleague is Surya Prakash. He was a senior journalist in the Indian Express. When he was chairman of Prasar Bharati, he produced a collection, a booklet on these speeches. So thank you very much, Surya. Thanks to him, these are now available to us easily. While reading that speech, I found something else. So Ambedkar lays out the three things we must remember while presenting the Constitution. One, he says, hold fast to constitutional methods to bring about, to achieve any social and economic objectives. And his third point, I'm skipping to deliberately, and you will know why. Third point, that this constitution is not just an instrument to seek political democracy, but we should also try and reach social democracy, which brings in the principles of liberty, equality, fraternity. And he said that's a trinity where one can't exist at the cost of the other. Having said that, why did I skip point 2? So point 2 is a very interesting one. And if I have to give a headline to point 2, I would call it Ambedkar on Bhakti cult in Indian democracy. And what does Ambedkar say? The second thing Ambedkar says we must do is to observe the caution from John Stuart Mill not to lay their liberties at the feet of even a great man or to trust him with powers which enable him to subvert the institutions. Right? This is a quote from John Stuart Mill that Ambedkar used. Now, these pronouns Please don't catch me that these pronouns are all out of date, because these were written a long time back. And then Ambedkar adds that there is nothing wrong with being grateful to those who've given you lifelong services, but there are limits. And then he quotes Irish patriot, early 19th century Irish patriot Daniel O'Connell. And again, Ambedkar quotes from Daniel O'Connell, and I use quote marks: "No man can be grateful at the cost of his honor. No woman can be grateful at the cost of her chastity." Early 19th century. So forgive Daniel O'Connell. "No man can be grateful at the cost of his honor. No woman can be grateful at the cost of her chastity. And no nation can be grateful at the cost of its liberty." And I go on quoting now from Ambedkar. This caution is much more important in India, for in India, bhakti, or what we may call path of devotion, the path of devotion or hero worship, plays a part in its politics, India's politics, unequaled in magnitude to the part it plays in the politics of any other country in the world. And further again, just listen to Ambedkar or read Ambedkar. He says, "Bhakti in religion may be a road to salvation of the soul. But in politics, bhakti or hero worship is a sure road to degradation and eventual dictatorship." Ambedkar said that. That's the speech from Ambedkar that the Sarsanghchalak in his Dussehra address today wanted all of us to read.